The pituitary gland can be considered two different organs, structurally and functionally. But there is this very specific line that goes right here and separates the pituitary glands. And this is what is called the pars intermedialis. I do not consider the pars intermedialis other than it separates the pituitary gland, but it actually makes some hormones associated with melanin production. Okay, so how do we identify which one is the anterior and which one's the posterior unless I tell you? Well, number one, you have to look for this structure here that is called the optic chiasma. And this is basically where the optic nerves cross. So if this is a top-down picture, looking at your head, eyes up in the front, your optic nerves cross. And this crossing is the optic chiasma right here. This is always anterior. And so by finding the optic chiasma, we can always know which one is anterior and which one is the posterior pituitary gland. The posterior pituitary gland, it's connected to the hypothalamus by way of this structure here, which is called the infundibulum. I don't know why I'm writing this. I have it right there. This little stalk right here, it has some neurons running through it. And there are more than just these two neurons running in the infundibulum, but we're just going to focus on these two. This one here is called the supraoptic nucleus. And this one here is called the paraventricular nucleus. And both of these are just simply named for their locations. These neurons make the only two hormones secreted by the posterior pituitary. These hormones are not made in the posterior pituitary. They are made up here in the cell bodies, up here in the hypothalamus. And then the hormones are transported anterograde down to the axon terminals where they kind of like wait for the signal to enter into the blood. So you might be thinking this sounds like a lot like a neurotransmitter, but remember, neurotransmitters are secreted only into a very small space, into a synapse, whereas hormones, they're secreted into blood circulation. What's important, really important about the posterior pituitary is that it does not make any hormones. It just stores hormones made by the hypothalamus. It's just holding the hormones for a friend. That's all. The posterior and the anterior pituitary glands, they differ a lot in their histology. The posterior pituitary gland stains very, very lightly due to the content of neurons and myelin. There are capillaries in there. While the anterior pituitary gland stains very, very darkly with those cells that are secreting their own hormones. In the posterior pituitary gland, there are these little tiny purple dots, and those represent the nuclei of surrounding neuroglia, right? The neurons themselves, though, are called pituocytes, and the name pituocyte is specific to the posterior pituitary gland. And it's this neuron composition that also gives the posterior pituitary gland the nickname of the neurophysis. ADH, or the antidiuretic hormone, it conserves water in the body. Its name, as it suggests, or what it's derived from, is that this hormone prevents diuresis, which is excessive urination. This hormone used to be called vasopressin. That's kind of an old name for it because it is one of the major hormones that increases blood pressure. But we've found now that it really does more than just increase blood pressure. Conserving water increases the pressure in your blood vessels, very similar to adding more water to a balloon. Right? ADH, it has more than one trigger. They're all neural, but it's triggered by several different factors. Pain, sensed by nociceptors that feed back to the hypothalamus, can trigger ADH. The saltiness of your blood, sensed by osmoreceptors in your hypothalamus, can trigger ADH. Your blood pressure, sensed by baroreceptors, and your hypothalamus could also trigger ADH. There's a lot of triggers, but they are all neural, as they all involve some type of nervous receptor. ADH is a life-saving mechanism for the conservation of water in the body. And this is really important because we are land mammals, and by definition, we are always dehydrated. It's just a fact of living on land. So let's use the example of blood saltiness, because we're going to see that again and again, and then like one more time again in this class. When your blood becomes salty, or better said, when your blood's osmolarity, or its colloid osmotic pressure, when that increases, osmoreceptors that are in the hypothalamus, they sense that increase and they detect that. And this is the supraoptic nucleus right here. So the supraoptic nucleus, what it does is it sends an action potential down this axon right here and tells the posterior pituitary gland to release ADH. And we know that's not the end of the story, right? Because ADH doesn't actually do anything. It's just a chemical messenger. So ADH, it then circulates throughout the bloodstream, targeting only specific organs that have the receptors. And in this case, the only organ that has receptors for ADH is the kidney. In fact, it's not just the kidney, but we'll leave it at that right now. But there are specific cells within the kidney that have ADH receptors. So ADH is also, because it increases blood pressure, but because it increases diuresis, excessive urination, ADH is also associated with the phenomenon known as breaking the seal. For example, after consuming alcohol, which is a diuretic, which shuts off ADH, you might hear someone say, oh, don't go to the bathroom, don't break the seal, because once you do, you'll be urinating all night. This idea, breaking the seal, relates to the idea of turning off ADH. Alcohol, nicotine, all the good stuff turns off ADH, and all of those lead to increased urination. When ADH is inhibited, you stop conserving water. And this not only results in frequent trips to the bathroom, it results in chemical dehydration of your blood. Oxytocin it's released in exactly the same way. Oxytocin, it's made in the cell body of the paraventricular nucleus in the hypothalamus. There are a few things that have to happen at the same time to trigger oxytocin, but they all involve chemoreceptors and they all involve the start of labor. There comes a point where the baby starts to make its own hormones, and then those hormones are sensed by the hypothalamus. And so the hypothalamus is like, okay, ready to eject one baby or more. And the hypothalamus, it sends this action potential down the paraventricular nucleus, and the paraventricular nucleus tells the cells in the posterior pituitary gland to release oxytocin, abbreviated as OXT. Oxytocin then circulates and attaches to receptors found on the myometrium, or on the contractile labor of the uterus. And what this does is oxytocin basically makes the uterus start to contract and, eject one baby or more.